had cause to be so scared of me. Like, I wish I really was a rapist and a killer, because then their fears would be justified. You know, like I actually kind of, then they would be right, and then it would be okay. But the fact that I'm not kind of makes me feel like wasn't given a fair trial, and I'm kind of being hung up to dry without even like having been able to plead my case. And yet I also realize that it's my fault too for not having tried to learn the language and the culture better. And yet it's kind of not my fault in a way too, because there's nothing particularly engaging about it. And I'm kind of old and my brain doesn't really pick up as well as it would have at one time. So I know it's kind of a two-way street with everything here, but I did try to learn the language at one point, and I did try to make some stabs in that direction, only because it was like living in a world of silence. You know, I kind of feel like I know what it feels like to be a deaf person now, because you're constantly in a world of darkness. And it's weird, you feel like you're a leper or an outcast, and yet there's nothing about this society that makes you really want to be part of it, and yet because you're not part of it, you feel it so acutely. Like you really do feel, because you are so different, you start to question who you are and yourself and where you're from, and are you right for being the way you are, and are they right for being the way they are because they're the majority? But because someone's a majority, does that make them right? Or is it just because you're from somewhere else and you see something different, you'll never quite fit in, you'll always be a square peg? It's almost like you're kind of allotted the same thing as if you just arrived, as if you've been here 10 years, because people aren't going to know whether you've been studying or you can speak the language, or if you have a Korean wife or whatever, but they're going to make assumptions just based right away on appearance. You know, and that's not their fault either, or your fault, but so much of the world is based on appearance, you know.
So, do you feel like you've had that same experience when you moved to Vietnam?
Well, it seems like it's a different type of there. It's more of you don't. It seems like in Korea that people here generally tend to try to do the right thing, and they're upstanding citizens, and they're not going to rip you off. They're not going to try to overcharge you. They're not going to try to take advantage of you. And you're not going to have to haggle for things. Things are kind of set in stone, but you know where the line is and you know what's right. People know what's right, and people tend to do what's right. Whereas I think in Vietnam, I think because it is more developing, and because of the history we have with that country and the history they've had with the West, they have a much more pragmatic view of how to deal with outsiders, but it seems like their take on it is more, I mean, I think both cases they're kind of using us as a tool in some way to advance themselves. But I think with Vietnam you have to be a bit more waresome in terms of what they could do to you if you're not careful. If you leave something on a bus, you'll probably get it back in Korea. In Vietnam, you're not going to get that thing back, or people will physically try to take things from you. You know, they'll come up and ride up and just grab something from you. And that's not something you would see happen here, necessarily. I have never heard of that kind of thing happening. So there's kind of a different moral code. And some people tell me that kind of sort of came out of the communist era, where I think before that it was a very Buddhist society where everything kind of had sort of a... But I think, you know, after the communists came in, they drove a lot of that you know, Confucius thinking out, and so the moral code kind of went by the wayside. And I think also having to fight all these wars with the West, I think they probably have a different conception of us, but at the same time there's a lot more playfulness with the people. I think there's an there's a easiness, there's a laughter, there's a jokingness that you don't quite get in Korea. You know, like I think because they've been invaded and occupied for so long that when they see a foreigner, they don't react in the same way. But it's more of a game that they play with us. But it's not. I don't get that feeling of people jumping off the sidewalk every time they see me either. It's like they kind of go about their business and yeah, they see who I am and they just go and do their thing. Whereas in Korea, I feel like I can't just walk down the sidewalk without causing a panic with other people, or I'm not a party crasher constantly, you know? I don't know. And it just seems like in Korea, everything is it's so much about the cement holding everything together, and everybody's in it together. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do, everybody knows where the line is, and we're all a group and we all know what we're doing. But in Vietnam, it seems like people are kind of doing their own thing, and everybody's very friendly, but there's not this mind meld going on so much. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Ah, they sound very different, but
But I think, but you know, also I think the Koreans have they've got a different set of realities. Like, I think geography determines a lot about a people or a race. Like the fact that they're sandwiched between China and Japan has given them that reality. The fact they're in the frozen north means they have to just they have to forward think everything in terms of like, and the resources are so limited. And how are they going to get through winter? And, you know, how are they going to survive? Whereas when you're close to the equator, you just look up and, you know, there's a mango growing. And, you know, you don't have this pressing sense of having to survive quite as much. And I know that, yeah, Vietnam were invaded by foreign powers, but you could definitely see when, you know, the first world countries were looking for places to colonize. I'm sure the first thing they were looking at was probably resources and weather and access to trade routes. And I'm sure they looked at Korea and said, they don't. This place is all mountainous. They don't really have much here we can exploit. But you get down to Southeast Asia, you know, got nice weather, tasty food, resources.